On the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. As a result of this, the German state had to begin the process of unifying the modern day German Republic, with what had existed as both the East and the West German states up until 1989. A big question that came about was how the hell the Germans were going to unify both the East and the West German militaries, especially with the East German military and the absolutely absurd amount of both material and manpower that they received from the East German NVA in 1989. To the surprise of very few people, the Germans would not exactly be turning away 50,000 plus people who were already serving in the NVA. The Germans needed to find a way to bring these guys on board and then decommission them or retire them slowly but surely. The newly unified German state basically, however, had a couple of major advantages in this regard. When those 50,000 troops arrived from the East Germans, a number of them were either conscripted troops or were serving very short term contracts. This allowed the Germans to very, very quickly sort of offload a substantial number of men without the need to get them properly integrated into an army which they were never going to serve in. In the face of growing calls for rapid demobilization, this was absolutely brilliant. The East German army could be rapidly reduced, offloaded, and most of their officers, pretty much everyone above a colonel level, was already being offloaded as it was. The West Germans didn't want any post-Soviet influence. Following the unification of Germany, the Bundeswehr would receive a massive amount of material from East Germany. This would include 767 aircraft, including helicopters and fixed wings. Of these aircraft, 24 were the newer MiG-29s, which had very recently arrived from the Soviet Union. 208 ships would also be received, alongside 2,761 tanks, over 100,000 wheeled vehicles, over 2,000 artillery pieces, nearly 1.4 million firearms, as well as 300,000 tons of ammunition and 14,000 tons of fuel and cleaning materials. By the time of 1999, however, most of this stuff would be destroyed. A lot of the equipment which was in service just wasn't needed. They were either sold on to friendly states, destroyed outright, or given away in what can only be described as very dodgy dealings. Most of this was destroyed by the German Material Depot Service Gesellschaft, or MDSG. However, not all equipment would be destroyed. In September and October of 1990, the Bundeswehr would found both the 13th and 14th Panzergrenadier Divisions, respectively. These units would be formed to integrate East German units into the Bundeswehr, or those that were being retained as they had longer term contracts. These units, therefore, would actually have a mix of both West and East German equipment in order to get both sides sort of accustomed to one another and also allow the East Germans to work on West German vehicles, which they would inevitably go on to use. This would also help to smooth integration between two sides, which literally a year prior had had guns pointed at one another, which told they were both each other's respective mortal enemies. Fortunately, this process would not be difficult. The NVA, or the National Volksdeutsche Armee, was remarkably well trained by Soviet standards. They were, in many cases, second only to the Soviet army in terms of their quality and equipment. They were basically going to be used as a sledgehammer by the Soviets to smash their way into West Germany and then allow the Soviets to sort of pile over. If any of you have ever played the game Warno, you'll absolutely know, however, that the East Germans were 100% going to be the sacrificial lamb on that front. The Soviets would have just absolutely thrown them to the wolves. So, while a lot of vehicles were scrapped, they did keep them for service within the 13th and 14th Panzergrenadier divisions. The most common of these were the T-72 series, B&P series, and a very limited number of T-55s. These were available in huge stocks. About 100 T-72s had actually been given to the East German state by Poland. These were more modernised versions and were the ones that were really quite well kept on. The vehicles would not, however, stay long within these units. The 13th and the 14th were part of the unit that was going to be rapidly demobilised. Already the Germans had retired the 11th, the 12th was getting reduced in numbers, And because the units were being slowly dismantled, the need for T-72s and T-55s just wasn't necessary. You had spare Leopards lying around. Why would you keep fielding Soviet armour? And slowly but surely these units began to integrate with more modern Western equipment. These vehicles were therefore began to basically be palmed off in other countries which already didn't need them. The Germans, therefore, when they went into places like Kosovo and Bosnia in the mid-1990s, didn't have any Soviet equipment. They were pretty much all Western German equipped by that time. The one vehicle, however, that continued to keep itself in service despite the fact that it was an ex-Soviet design was the MiG-29. The MiG-29 in the 1990 was still a pretty damn good design, even if these MiG-29s were not quite as good as the Soviet models, because the Soviets never gave their client states the best stuff because of fears that those client states might revolt against the Soviet state. The MiG-29s in these occasions, however, were actually quite good. They were more modern than what you would expect to be given to a client state. The MiG-29s were all kept in service by the Bundeswehr, mostly because why would you get rid of a MiG-29? There is absolutely no point. These vehicles had some issues, but were more than capable of hanging with the more modern West German equipment. The Germans in particular fielded a large number of Phantoms at this point in time. They'd had them as a Cold War, for the Cold War as their primary air-to-air interceptor. However, by this point, they were already looking at phasing them out as the Eurofighter project was starting to really pick up pace at this time. The MiG-29s would bring a different sphere of aerial combat. Most of the old East German pilots were retained for the processes of integrating the MiG-29. And although they couldn't carry some of the heavier weapons that the Phantoms could, the R-73 was still a very, very decent air-to-air missile, a heat-seeking air-to-air missile, and the MiG-29s could absolutely box with the Phantoms. There was no disregarding that. They could easily tangle with them. By 1999, however, all but two of them had been phased out and given to the Polish Air Force, and this is because of the fact that the first Eurofighters would then arrive in 2003, and the Germans would start getting rid of pretty much all of their ex-Cold War stuff. The only exception were things such as the Tornadoes, which continued to be used because the Germans were still testing out the idea of using carpet bombing with cluster rounds, which is quite German. The Bundeswehr would pretty much scrap everything else that it just didn't need. Pretty much all of the ex-Soviet artillery got scrapped because there was just no need for it. The Germans they didn't need any of the self-propelled guns. They had Patriots, and they were developing the Panzerhaubitzen, which would come into service in the 2000s. They also had a wealth of American artillery systems which they could call upon. They could go and buy half a dozen guns from the Americans and not need to integrate them properly. There was no need for Soviet caliber weapons. They were either sold off or just scrapped, as were most of the small arms, as was pretty much all of the spare ammunition, which wasn't immediately necessary. The Germans made $1.50 off of just selling this old Soviet style stuff that they didn't need. A lot of deals, however, were also the illegal stuff. At this point in time, this is like the 1990s are the height of sort of the arms trade, where all the Soviet client states have collapsed. There's just an absolute buck ton of cheap Soviet stuff lying around. Guys were selling stuff off illegally, and very, very few people really caught wind of it, or if they did, there wasn't a whole lot doing about it. Germany managed to clamp down on this relatively quickly compared to states in the East where it was just complete chaos, because unlike in Germany where you had integrated a Western and Eastern state and there was already sort of a pre-existing government there to sort of deal with any problems, in Eastern Europe there was no governments. These guys were all reforming governments from brand new, or they were breaking away from the old Soviet Union, so countries like Ukraine, the Baltics, Belarus. All these guys are all breaking away and are trying to form new governments. So there's just like illegal weapon sales are pretty much out the backside. It's happening. The integration process, however, did take time, which is why the Germans didn't field any army outside of West Germany until the 1990s. Which is why they were also continuing to use this equipment, even though they phased it out quite quickly post-unification. it's still taking time to integrate. There were actually minor calls for the Germans to send units to Operation Desert Storm in '91. There was a bit of a and and should we, shouldn't we? However, that's probably a very good idea that they didn't. Probably because they were demilitarizing so quickly, and also because if they had suddenly gone, yep, we'll send units to come and fight in 1991 against Desert Storm, the 13th and 14th would have probably been called up. And I don't think the idea of using T-72s against Saddam's T-72s is a very, very good idea, especially not with A-10s involved. Especially when A-10 pilots at the time were not particularly good at identifying their vehicles correctly. I'm not going to stop bringing up the Warrior issue. A Warrior looks nothing like a BMP. I'm sorry, that's complete nonsense. By 2000, pretty much the Germans have pretty much phased out all Soviet era equipment. Any traces of the NVA have gone, and that's pretty much it for the unification of the German states. So yeah, just a bit of a small one, just a bit of a fun one I did for a bit of a laugh. I do hope you enjoy it, and I'll look to see you on the next one.